This episode is brought to you by the Toyota Grand Highlander. Life's journey brings constant change filled with exciting surprises and grand challenges. And with its spaciousness, power, and style, the Toyota Grand Highlander is more than a vehicle. It's your partner in embracing all life throws at you. From the spacious adult-sized third row to seating for up to 8 passengers, the Toyota Grand Highlander is up for every grand challenge. Learn more at toyota.com/Grand Highlander. Toyota, let's go places.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
All you ever wanted to know about King Greenhead in this 4-part series about the history of the North American mallard. In our final episode in this series, we also talk with Dr. Phil Lavretsky and PhD student Dominic Hockenbury about ongoing mallard genetics research in North America. Are the prairies going dry forever? Is the breeding habitat for mallards doomed? Are wild mallards doomed by game farm genetics? What is the future of the wild North American mallard? We also hit the highlights of spring migration near Jack's Reef and talk breeding ground conditions. All this week on the Foul Weather Podcast. Remember that this last season you knew where the ducks were at before the ducks knew where they were at. We're very thankful for our every week listeners. Y'all know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days to hunt because the Foul Weather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at, right? Shoot the ducks from the north before they know where they're at. Also, just a reminder as well to take a minute to rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We appreciate your support very, very much. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. What a few weeks of migration by the farm. The snow geese and Canada geese seem to have moved on to the north for the most part, but we still have lots of ducks around, at least in the last couple weeks before this recording. One of my students from my lab found a Eurasian widgeon on the lake by ESF. They seem to be kind of common on the Pacific coast, but we always have about a half dozen or so around here, but they're fun and kind of tough to find. And we also did a couple of waterfowl counts on the nearby National Wildlife Refuge with students from my lab and a bunch of kids from the ornithology class at ESF. So these are volunteer surveys for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the refuge that kind of go impoundment by impoundment to count ducks, geese, and swans on a weekly basis, typically during the spring migration mostly. I'd say at first, last week we were really, I'm recording a few weeks out here, so this was a while back, maybe 3 weeks for y'all now. We were really iced up and ducks were just in the flooded areas along the river. These are areas that are specifically managed kind of to receive floodwaters when the Erie Canal Seneca River comes up. And they're meant to grow moist soil seed and tuber-producing plants to feed hungry migrating ducks. We had one area of about 90 acres total with 14,000 ducks on it, mostly mallards, black ducks, and pintails, and actually probably mostly pintails, believe it or not. So believe it or not, eastern pintails are a thing. I keep pounding this drum. And they aren't all coming from the prairies, folks. In fact, we've collaborated on some research, and I don't think it's even published yet other than in kind of PhD dissertation form. But that research shows that pintails that migrate through kind of the southern Ontario, New York, and Ohio portions of the Great Lakes are produced in the James Bay lowlands. So that's kind of like Hudson Bay, that little pointy part is specifically its own bay, James Bay lowlands, kind of the area, the wetland area around the bay, and then eastern Hudson Bay lowlands, and then the rest of Quebec to a larger degree. Those pintails are coming from that area to a larger degree than the mid-continent. But we aren't sure of this for other ducks that migrate to our region and up and down the Atlantic coast. So along with Delta Waterfowl Foundation and other partners, my lab at ESF is going to be using stable isotope combined with banding analysis To estimate to what extent green-winged teal, widgeon, and gadwall come from Quebec and other eastern provinces of Canada as compared to kind of that mid-continent, prairie, and boreal region where we always think most ducks come from, which is true, but it is quite possible that the Atlantic flyway harvest, at least portions of the Atlantic flyway harvest, could be deriving a greater portion of their ducks from Quebec. We found this for scaup at the northern bluebills, I would say, lesser and greater scaup, which we'll call bluebills here, that a large portion, specifically greater scaup, are coming from Quebec that are harvested at the northern end of the flyway. As you move further south, they increasingly come from the prairies. But we're not sure for these other ducks, so this is a way to ensure that we're sending conservation dollars to the right places, right? Anyhow, that said, this week after the ice receded, I'd say melted, the ducks moved around a bunch, exploiting other food resources. Kind of the mallards, black ducks, and pintails moved on to the north, and they were replaced by green-winged teal, widgeon, shovelers, gadwall, and even the start of the blue-winged teal migration this far north up into central New York, which seems early for me. But next week, I'm headed to Washington, D.C. area, Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, with a graduate student to pull feathers from wings from the Parts Collection Survey, which is a vital part of the Harvest Information Program, or HIP. And a lot of you have probably been selected for the survey and sent wings into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's where we're headed, to help those folks out, to age and sex those birds, to get the age ratios and the sex ratio and the harvest. But we're also collecting feathers for stable isotope work, as noted above, funded by Delta. It turns out that you can use the ratio of heavy to light hydrogen as a signature in a feather, and it will tell you within 175 miles where that duck grew that feather. Really cool stuff, right? Because once grown, that signature is fixed until that feather is molted again the next year. That duck carries that location information in that feather. The building blocks of that feather leave us a geographic signature that's, okay, so somewhat of a geographic signature. It's really good at telling us the north to south, where that duck came from, north to south. But then we can refine that estimate using banding data that tells us the trajectory of that duck's migration. Are they mostly recovered east or west of James Bay, or did they come from the mid-continent region or eastern Canada? Again, pretty cool stuff. So thanks to Delta Waterfowl Foundation for seeing the utility in our work and helping us understand where conservation dollars need to be spent to conserve ducks harvested in the Atlantic Flyway. After D.C., we're headed to Mississippi for an invited guest talk on the state of duck hunting and duck conservation in North America. I'm still building that talk, so looking forward to catching up with friends and colleagues down there and maybe even slipping in a little bit of turkey hunting. The point? Yeah, spring is in the air and on the move. The spring peepers have been singing on those warm, wet nights. We saw our first tree swallow of the year last week during that waterfowl survey. An eastern phoebe visited me in the back gully of the farm during a break that we were taking from making a fallen black cherry tree into firewood. And soon enough, we will be visited by all the great birds coming back from the south, coming back from Central America, coming back from South America, and coming back from the Gulf Coast and southern U.S. as well. But maybe we won't be seeing as many come back as we'd like. If you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, you likely saw the graphic of the population trajectories of various groups of birds: forest birds, grassland birds, water birds, shorebirds, and yes, ducks. That is all of this is part of the State of the Birds report that is put out every 3 years. What's going to first strike you when you see this graphic is how poorly many species of birds are doing. Next, as a duck hunter, you're probably going to notice that dabbling and diving ducks have been doing much better than other groups of birds in general. I think then people's attention is drawn to, or at least the duck hunters out there, their attention is drawn to, the recent decline in dabbling and diving ducks that is captured by the results. But what a lot of folks won't see is the same dip back around 2005 when we also had low populations. Many have used this graphic to note that ducks are in trouble, just like the other groups of birds. But we do have to remember how much more duck populations typically fluctuate and cycle compared to other bird species like forest birds. Forest birds like warblers and thrushes. These forest birds have just shown a steady decline as we cut up their habitats into housing and other human development areas, mostly in the eastern U.S. and eastern North America. We also have to remember that the no net loss of wetlands policy put in place by the George Bush Sr. administration is no longer working. We've gutted the Clean Water Act, and we continually open up ways to remove wetlands in abundance and reduce quality wetlands across duck country USA. To me, all of this is an assault on duck hunters and duck hunting culture, and it is up to each and every one of us to stand up for wetlands and grasslands. Grassland birds are among the steepest decline when you look at those graphs. Ducks seem a bit more adaptable, so they continue to do well. But we know that grassland conservation is in trouble and is going through a period of conversion to row crop agriculture that is real. And it's going to hit the sensitive species like bobolinks that are in free fall first. This is a canary in the coal mine story. These birds are telling us a story, and it might be that ducks are next. It's telling us a story about how we are treating the planet, and damn it, we need to do better. It is my hope that ducks will continue to cycle with the long-term weather patterns of this planet, that rains will bring a new day of hope. But a lot of waterfowl biologists right now are holding their breath to see if we did so much damage to the prairies during this last dry cycle that it might not recover just the same. It is already a shell of what it once was. The North American prairies are an endangered ecosystem, and it is a shell of what it once was. And only through very concerted efforts by waterfowl joint ventures and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and Wetland Reserve easements, only with duck stamp dollars to purchase and preserve remaining wetlands and grasslands, only with all the recreation and environmental-based programs that pump money into conservation, that is the only way any of this landscape looks remotely like it once did when our friends, the ducks, fly back north in spring. Look, folks, God ain't making any more earth for us, so it's time to stand up for a clean environment. Sure. We want progress, but we want sound, intelligent progress that's good for the ducks and good for people. I do think a lot of folks feel helpless in this fight, but don't feel helpless, because you're not. Alone, you may be helpless. This is not a fight you fight by yourself, but as a million duck hunters and hopefully as millions of concerned conservationists, we can have an influence. And then we can keep these ducks and other birds with us. Then we can see clouds of ducks in front of our blinds that originated thousands of miles away in a sea of grass dotted with millions of small, medium, and large wetlands. Folks, birds are not in a good place. And they are a barometer to our own human health and the health of this planet. So let's get the good work done today. Next, we dig deep into what we know about game farm mallards and how they differ from wild North American mallards. So please, stick with us. Look, folks, the Farmland Group across the Mid-South is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisals. If you own land or you want land, the Farmland Group is where it's at. With over $500 million in farm sales and growing, Gwynn and Shelby Smith have you covered. Look, if you're thinking about buying or selling, contact the Farmland Group to access their full suite of services. If you already own property and want to build equity and value, the Farmland Group gets it done. If you're looking to purchase a new property, well, they get that done too, and they have access to some of the best lending available. Looking to sell? Get it appraised with the Farmland Group affiliated appraiser. But let's be clear for our listenership too. They also offer farm and hunt property management to create places that attract more ducks and more bucks. Who doesn't want that? More ducks and more bucks. Let the Farmland Group build value into your property. Find them today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. You're not going to be disappointed. Contact Shelby Smith today at farmlg.com and let him know that the Foul Weather Podcast sent you their way. Just an update, the Farmland Group now has $130 million in listings for farmland and other recreational properties, so please do have a look at all their available services in the near future. You won't be disappointed. All right, and into today's topic at hand. We've touched on this topic on several occasions before and over the past year, so it seems that more and more info is getting to duck hunters about game farm mallards and their potential negative impact on the wild North American mallard. So what I'm going to do today is speak to that topic and start off with why and how game farm mallards differ from wild North American mallards. First, the game farm mallard, or the mallard we release for shooting purposes, is not from North America. Under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it is not legal to bring a wild mallard into captivity for domestication purposes. So when we look to supplement wild mallard populations, we look to Europe, who already had mallards in captivity for hundreds of years. As the Atlantic coast became highly urbanized, forests were cleared for agriculture, and coastal wetlands were degraded, black duck populations declined precipitously, and waterfowl hunters looked to supplement hunting opportunities by releasing game farm mallards of European descent. In North America, studies continue to find a close association among game farm mallard hybridization with wild North American mallards and regions of intense game farm mallard releases. That is, where we find the hybridization between game farm mallards of European descent and wild North American mallards. These are also the regions that we have released game farm mallards most intensively. Among regions, greater than 90% of releases of game farm mallards have historically occurred in the Atlantic coast of North America. Approximately 500,000 game farm mallards were released annually from 1920 to 1950 to supplement populations, and greater than 200,000 have been released annually since. Our own lab at ESF with graduate student Hunter Collins, he just finished up with us. He's now working in the Southeast region for Ducks Unlimited. Hunter found that the number across the U.S. is at least 280,000 as of last year, and possibly as high as 400,000 to this day. Woo. By 2010, only about 8% of mallards on the Atlantic coast were pure wild, and the prevalence of game farm by wild mallard hybrids generally decreased westward, with one caveat. The prevalence of game farm by wild mallard hybridization actually nowadays appears to be increasingly moving west. In fact, in northwest Ohio, it was detected that only 35% of sampled mallards are now still pure wild mallards. These areas of game farm mallard releases and hybridization with wild mallards also have recorded declines in mallard breeding populations. The U.S. portion of the eastern mallard population saw a 50% decline in breeding mallards during their survey over a 20-year period. This is actually masked by a Canadian population of mallards, which tends to be more wild and is slightly increasing to flat through time. So overall, what you will read is only a 20% decline in eastern mallards, but the U.S. portion, where most of the releases have happened, did see a 50% decline in abundance over a 20-year period. Also, the Great Lakes mallard population, kind of centered around Michigan, has followed suit as well, although those declines are not as drastic. Okay, so all of that is speculative, right? And coincidence does not equal causation. So let's detail now how game farm mallards, pure wild mallards, and the hybrids between those two, how these groups differ from each other. We're going to put this into the categories of morphology, that is kind of size and shape of mallards, feeding adaptations, migration, and nesting metrics. Some of this work is from my own studies with graduate students and colleagues, and some of this information comes from colleagues that we know. And so we'll do our best to ensure everyone involved gets credit for this great work. All right, so game farm mallards are physically and completely different beasts than wild mallards. Let's just start with that. Game farm mallards are different beasts than wild mallards. First, the differences, and then why we think these differences exist. Game farm mallards have shorter, wider, and taller bills than wild mallards. The nail at the end of the bill is longer than wild mallards, and the spacing of those fine tooth-like structures, or lamellae, is less in game farm than wild mallards. Overall, their bills are more goose-like, adapted for pecking or plucking, than for sieving through mud for seeds, tubers, and invertebrates. Game farm mallard legs and bodies are longer, but their heads and wings are shorter. This results in an odd wing-to-body length ratio that differs greatly from wild mallards. So why the differences? Well, if you think about 400 generations of captivity, then you might start to get your answer. You see, the wild mallard genome is shaped by nature. Those that have bills, wings, legs, and bodies in general that are not good at surviving, well, they don't make it and their genes don't get passed on to the next generation. Also, think of it this way. A mallard carries a lot of genetic code. Some of it that is expressed in a generation and others that are not. That is, you physically see that genetic code in the shape and form and behaviors of that animal, and in some generations, those are not expressed. This massive amount of genetic code is what enabled mallards to survive for millions of years as a species. Heck, they likely still have genetic code from the wonder chicken, which is thought of as the long time ago ancestor of modern waterfowl. So when we stop putting natural pressure on a mallard to look a certain way, they can express that genetic code. In captivity, we have relaxed the selective pressures of nature, and so maybe long legs are okay. These ducks also haven't had to strain food for 400 generations, so the bills start to change into one that is good at pecking for pellets and grain. The wings are no longer as necessary for long flight, or maybe breeders selected for quick growth until flight, and so we got a shorter wing. No matter, all of this is called artificial selection, which varies greatly from the natural selective pressures on wild mallards. So, okay, the bill is different, but how does that affect feeding? In trials with pure wild and pure game farm mallards, fed 3 different sizes of foods: large grains like corn and soybeans, medium-sized natural seeds like millet, and tiny natural seeds like pigweed or amaranth. These foods were mixed into a standardized mud slurry to mimic wetland conditions, and we detected that game farm mallards ingested food at 50% of the rate of wild mallards. So something seems to be going on with the bill that doesn't enable these birds to obtain food and likely store fat as well. And if you go back to part 2, which goes through the annual cycle of a hen mallard, we know that fat is a major metric for these birds, right? But something is going on with the bill. It could be the gross shape and size, how that is different from a wild mallard. It also could be how they can feel those foods in their bill. Just like your fingertips, ducks have mechanoreceptors so they can feel food. So you can imagine if you're fed pellets and grains from a bowl for 400 generations that the need to feel your food may decrease, and mechanoreceptors may be reduced in game farm mallards. Our current PhD student, Dominic Hockenbury, in our lab is currently working on the mechanoreceptor question, and the prior morphology work was conducted by Susanna Halligan as a master's student in collaboration with Dr. Ariel Fournier at Forbes Biological Station, Dr. Brian Davis at Mississippi State University, and our good friend Dr. Phil Lavretsky at the helm of the genetics portion of the research. All right, on to migration. Dr. Ben Luukkonen from Michigan State, who we've had on the Foul Weather podcast before, as well as Dr. Bradley Cohen in Tennessee and his students, detected that mallards with some percentage of game farm genes migrated differently. Specifically, Dr. Luukkonen detected that when wild mallard ancestry dropped below about 60 to 70%, that is, they had less wild mallard ancestry in them and more game farm, that the likelihood of fall migration and distance migrated dropped substantially. Where mallards from Michigan, the Michigan portion of the Great Lakes, once went to places like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, now they only go to the Ohio River Valley or maybe just over into Kentucky. Some didn't even migrate at all when the weather became harsh, and some of them also died during winter trying to stay north. So there seems to be a very strong survival pressure here when those game farm genes are included. Similarly, but during spring migration, the Cohen Lab, in collaboration with Dr. Phil Lavretsky, again at the helm of the genetics work, found that increased game farm ancestry resulted in later migration, shorter migration, and later in the season nesting attempts. All metrics we know lead to lower survival and reproductive output. Whew, not looking good. Hunter Collins was mentioned earlier, and he started investigating morphology of hybrids compared to game farm and wild mallards. So what do they look like when we combine them, right? Susanna Halligan found that game farm and wild mallards are completely different beasts. What Hunter found was that when we look at the hybrids, that they are an intermediate form between the two, indicating what we thought, that not only is genetic material from game farm mallards making it into the wild population, but it is also being expressed, changing the constitution of the mallard genome, their physical form, and likely their behaviors, and then survival and reproduction, which could be influencing free-flying wild North American mallards. In that Michigan State University study, Dr. Luukkonen also found that increasing proportion of game farm mallard ancestry was associated with significantly lower probability of actually even initiating nest incubation, indicating that early generational hybrids had low productivity. So when you mix a game farm mallard with a wild mallard, they had lower reproductive output. Sedentary behavior, high use of urban areas, and low incubation incidence of game farm ancestry mallards raises concern about hybridization events. Whew. Now, here's the deal, my friends. We've put rigorous sideboards on all of our research, as have the folks I've mentioned, and all this work is objective and run through the scientific process, goes through peer review, just like all the work we do. But I'm taking my scientist hat off for a second to make a comment. The initial releases of game farm mallards was to supplement the population as black ducks declined, but nowadays game farm mallard releases are increasingly used differently. As flying targets, I would say, or to attract ducks to your location for shooting. So from an ethical standpoint, this does not follow with the North American model of wildlife conservation. Animals are not just targets. That is a guiding principle. But remember that federal and state agencies do not, or at least should not, make decisions based on ethics. They are making decisions on biological information. Their question would be, do game farm mallard releases compromise our capacity as a conservation community to sustain mallards on this continent? They aren't even differentiating between game farm and wild mallards in surveys, not because they wouldn't want to, but currently they can't. So while I've always seen release of game farm mallards for the purpose of shooting as repugnant, I would say we are still unraveling the mystery about if game farm mallards are the demise of the wild North American mallard as we know it. But man, those stakes are really high, so we need to get this right. At this time, all the information collected shows that game farm mallards and hybridization with wild mallards is not positive. And so for now, we will have to leave it there. In my opinion, the jury is still out, but the evidence, it is surely mounting. Up next, we talk with Dr. Phil Lavretsky and PhD student Dominic Hockenbury about the future of wild North American mallards. So please, stick with us. Hold on, folks. Don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The Foul Weather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at foulweather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. If you are interested in wetland or other wildlife habitat consulting, contact me at drmike@foulweather.co. We specialize in wetland management strategies, but also food plots and green space renewals. So give us a holler and see if our services are for you. All right, up first today to talk about game farm mallards and how they may affect the future of the wild North American mallard is a name you all have heard before. He's been on our podcast. He's been on other podcasts throughout the last few years. Dr. Phil Lavretsky, so doesn't need a lot of intro. He wears a lot of hats as a quality academic at the University of Texas, El Paso. He's a passionate duck hunter. I tried talking to him this morning on the phone. He was dropping the kids off at school, so husband and father. And he has also a lot of other genetics projects in the works other than just mallards. So welcome, Phil, to the Foul Weather Podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Excited to be here. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you talk about game farm mallards with me every single day anyway, right?
No, it's every other day.
Every other day. Hey, I tell you though, you've gotten worn out because we used to do like these afternoon things. Maybe you didn't, but I would like sunny kind of June afternoon. I'd pour a bourbon and then sit on the porch and just BS ducks with you, you know. So, but you've gotten busy. You're like harder to get a hold of than you used to be. So,
yeah, it's unfortunate. Fortunate and unfortunate, all the deep rabbit holes that my group here continues to dig out.
Well, so genetics wise, talk to me. Like just start listing off ducks and waterfowl species you've worked on for genetics first, and then we'll hit all the other things. Maybe rabbits are part of that. I'm not sure.
All of them? Well, technically, I've now worked on all 45 species of waterfowl here in North America. And then I have a whole bunch out of Australia. So we just finished Australia, right? So a year ago we were there. So magpie geese, Pacific black ducks, they're what they call the wood duck or mountain duck, pink-eared duck. What else did we get? Gray teal and chestnut teal. We got those out there. So that was super cool. And then New Zealand, the same thing, paradise ducks and gray ducks out of there, of course, all their mallards,
other critters,
and other critters. Well, right now we just went into the other edible birds, so turkeys. So we got turkeys for turkey season right now. Wild turkey DNA starting out, so that's super cool. That was fun. We've got a project with you on turkeys in New York, so that's also a lot of fun. I'm on the works and on the to potentially have a grizzly bear project.
That's sweet.
That's gonna be the one that's out there.
Here's one. I'm gonna try to top you because I can't wait to like social media this one. Do you have any bald eagle stuff?
No.
I'm so happy. So I can't wait. We have a bald eagle paper coming out in the Wilson. What is that? Wilson Journal of Ornithology. It is now, and I can't wait to put it on social media and just write America.
That's your America paper. Oh, that's cool.
Gotta get
eagles. Good work.
It is neat working across all the different species for sure. But let's bring it back to mallards here. We've been working on this game farm stuff together, National Science Foundation grant, some other stuff with collaborators through time across the country. But what we're going to do today is something a little bit fun for the listeners. Is we're going to do this, Phil, is a choose your own adventure style exercise. And for those folks that know, maybe some young folks on here, I had to ask, Dominic's on next on the interview stuff after you. And I was like, hey, do you even know what these are? It was a book series where you'd like pick different ways to like save the princess. And the Choose Your Own Adventure series of books was kind of shuttered in 1999 by computer games and the internet and all that kind of stuff. There was just other things going on. But in January 2019, ChooseCo, which is the company, actually initiated a trademark infringement legal challenge against Netflix for the film Black Mirror. And Netflix settled that suit in November 2020, which is actually, I feel like, a pretty short time frame for something like
It's
that.
really fast. They just did not go to court.
We're gonna hopefully stay away from all that stuff. But Phil, my research budget and your research budget and Foulweather's budget might be able to maybe help us on a suit. But I think we're okay here with this one. But anyhow, the way we're gonna do this. So what I said was a choose your own adventure style thought process or thought exercise. So we're not. It's different.
Do it.
Like in the theme of those types of things. All right. So here are your choices with Game Farm Mallards. And I've already gone over in the podcast, like all the research and stuff we've done together with folks across the country. So people are familiar with what's going on with the differences between game farms and wild mallards. So your choices are, we continue to release Game Farm Mallards into the foreseeable future. Period. That's it. Number 2 is interesting. States in the Central and Mississippi Flyway make release of Game Farm Mallards highly restrictive, greatly reducing the number to less than 1,000 each year in each flyway. But the Pacific and Atlantic flyways actually increase release of Game Farm Mallards in response to declining numbers of mallards in general that are showing up in their neighborhood. And then number 3, we have a wholesale ban on release of Game Farm Mallards. So we continue to release, wholesale release, or that in-between scenario. Which do you choose and why?
Well, my personal preference would be the last one. I choose the last one. I think the others effectively do nothing for the change and potentially result in the ultimate consequence of stalking, which is more stalking. My personal... If I was king,
yes,
would be to stop Game Farm Mallard releases and then watch that whole scientific experiment play out. We've watched a scientific experiment play out for 100 years with the release of them, and our data, right? Me, you, and our NSF and all the other stuff that we've worked on, especially all the historical stuff, suggests that, Mother Nature constantly is trying to push it back to wild. And it's this trickle effect that's potentially the ultimate issue, right? And the more and more that continue to be put out, the more and more further down the game farm hole we go. And so the stop of it, I would imagine, so I'll have to play out what I think is going to happen, which is what we typically see in stocks, which is quite the die-off. Maybe a population decline in some parts of this country, particularly in the Atlantic Flyway, until there's sort of this revamp of genes that have been reestablished, that have the adaptive qualities required for migration, survival, fecundity, nesting, and so forth. At which case, we should see some sort of stability and finally get our birds back to whatever the carrying capacity is of that habitat.
So how many years, like, say we turn off the spigot of Game Farm Mallards going into the Atlantic Flyway, for instance, right? In like the worst areas for hybridization and down to less than 8% pure wilds in like Connecticut, Massachusetts, that kind of realm of the world. In that kind of epicenter, like do we know how many years it would take to like reset that system, or is that something that's still being kind of worked on in general?
Yeah, good question. So when we look at the historical data, and I think we've shared that with you, or you've seen it, there's two time points in which it looks like people started and stopped. And it looked like exactly about a decade or about 3 generations, assuming 2.5 years for every generation, where you have this peak and it all of a sudden falls back down to essentially zero. So it takes
So
about that.
when you say started and stopped, you mean started releasing game farms and then
And then it looks
stopped?
like it
Yeah,
stopped. Yeah.
yeah.
So you have these peaks, and then all of a sudden, 10 years later, you have almost near zero ancestry in the landscape. So that tells me there's been these ebbs and flows. And then at some point, people really got going and put them out there. The problem with the northeastern part of the US side of the Atlantic flyways, when we look at summer birds, or things that are supposed to be local, almost 98% or higher in some states, some places like Massachusetts, almost 100%, where there are no truly wild birds, right? It's always like 80 or so percent wild North American, 20% game farm. And in those situations, that is a scenario where you just don't have a parental pool to backcross. So we're going to have to basically say, well, that's pretty wild unless we want to put, or there's a natural flow from the prairie potholes or
Hmm.
other regions into that to help start moving some of that kind of remnant stuff that perhaps has no effect, right? Maybe we just say that's good enough. As long as they're biologically wild, we can start moving forward. But, only time will tell.
Got it. So what happens? I think the easy one to go to, the next choose your own adventure. I'm going to throw all these at you. I appreciate that you
Yeah.
picked that one. I think the evidence kind of shows right now. I mean, I don't want to throw you under the bus here. It's like we're doing objective science. We're asking questions. We're putting forth very solid hypotheses, gathering data, analyzing it, and then putting that out, into the science sphere, and then letting the management community digest that stuff and make decisions, right? But
Yep. Yeah,
what
absolutely.
what seems to be happening is that the prediction of like, hey, these game farmy things aren't great continues to kind of show up, right? So
Yeah.
I
No,
don't
it's
want I don't
independent.
want people
Yeah.
out there to be like Phil's all biased and so science is biased because that ain't it. And in fact, you and I disagree on stuff all the time in this
Oh yeah.
realm,
No,
and that's how it works.
every single study is just the hypothesis. The two hypotheses are there is no difference, and the other one there is a difference, and we're constantly just testing it. And they're independent data sets over and over and over and
Mhm.
over. And the ultimate answer continues to be there is a difference. And in the places where we can ask, is this bad or good? We continue to see a significant difference in, let's say, migration or nesting propensity between these types of birds.
Right. Which ultimately
So
affects kind of survival, reproductive metrics, and then
population,
populations at some point, right?
yeah.
So let's go right to the number one. We continue to release game farm mallards into the foreseeable future. I mean, I think you
Yeah,
kind of already hit it, but like nail that one for me.
status quo. Yeah,
Yeah.
so status quo, if you give it another couple hundred years, will be, I don't know, France. Then
Oh, tell me
and
about France. Though the folks they don't all know about France.
yeah.
So France
Yeah,
is like
so
what, the size of Texas?
is it? I thought Texas is always bigger than anything. Yeah, it's
All
about
right.
the size of
Yeah.
Texas. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Europe, generally speaking, has been using game farm mallards, have been releasing game farm mallards since their inception somewhere in England around 1650. So they've been doing it a lot for a very long time. And current estimates or known, numbers of birds that they are pumping out, especially in France, is in the millions, right? It's like 2 or 3 million a year for
Yeah.
them to have sort of a fall flight of mallards these days.
And
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 this
and
is,
for
yeah,
reference, the wild mallard population, supposedly, if they can count it that way, on the Camargue, which are the southern France Mediterranean wetlands, is like 270,000 in the winter. So they're
yeah,
releasing, like, let's just go with 2.3 million mallards, but their
yeah,
wintering population of wild mallards is only 270,000.
yeah.
That's rough.
Yeah, yeah. So so in one of the studies that we published on where we got birds out of all over Europe and Eurasia actually through our colleagues European colleagues. Yeah, France basically had no wild mallards. They were just a bunch of feral birds, or we consider them feral because we never know if they just came out of a cage or they've been on the landscape for a while. So Yeah, and to be fair, you could just go stay here in North America and be like, well, how's your like favorite bobwhite location, unless or pheasant location where if they're not putting some birds out, there's usually no other birds around, or your favorite, trout fishing hole where they've got to be stocking them because they all die out come winter or summer, depending on which one's the more extreme time point. So yeah, so as you continue to trickle, the problem is that you continue to add all this. I'll just call them inferior traits.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them survive, some of them don't, but in general, the proportion of the population will eventually get to a tipping point. Our hypothesis that tipping point potentially is there on the U.S. side of the north of the Atlantic Flyway, at least in the Northeast, where you're going to have significant impacts to the population's ability to survive and grow, and in fact might be going towards more negative. And so my theory would be that eventually that population will continue to decline, and those traits will continue to spread westward as more of those birds are pumped in and they mate pair and so forth, as we're seeing now.
And we've seen that before. And the one way I always go with this, Phil, is we need to get this right, because the only thing at stake is the survival of the giant wild North American mallard population, which so much of duck hunting industry and conservation runs on, right?
Yeah.
Like
exactly.
That's where as soon as I saw this, I'm like, this is when I got to ESF, I was like, this is the first thing we need to work on, because this probably has the greatest impact on the greatest number of people and the greatest amount of conservation dollars out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. Like, do you want to have a situation, the pheasant situation like I had in Ohio, where there's state dollars that has to be allocated so that way they can go and buy some pheasants, in this case, stamp dollars, to go buy some mallards that they release, so your state might have some mallards on the landscape. I mean, there's actually a history in some places like South Carolina where certain entities actually did that in the more recent times, so that they would release right before hunting season, and so there'd be, quote unquote, some mallards on the landscape.
Mallards at the beginning of season nowadays with the changes in weather in South Carolina. Not a thing. Not a natural thing. Not a natural thing. Yeah.
Enjoy your blue wings and Gadwall.
Man, I was down there this winter, and the teal shooting on those coastal wetlands in South Carolina was just awesome. I think sometimes, and if you start looking, I dug into some metrics from Tennessee, and their mallard harvest, corrected for effort, kind of ebbs and flows with the mallard breeding population. But their other duck harvest has just gone up. Like, there's other species doing great: gadwalls, green wings. Widgeon kind of here and there, but there's a lot of other cool stuff out there to chase.
Man,
so I don't know. I'm still a greenhead guy, but
well, like you said, the industry was built on it. I mean, look at any magazine, you're going to see a bunch of folks coming out with a string of greenheads on there, trying to sell a Polaris. Or
we could just make a podcast called Greenheads Matter, and it would probably work, right? Like, just think of it that way. All right, the last one where states
is that hashtag GHM, Greenheads Matter, GHM.
GHM. I like that. Phil's making new new social content here. So you good with the full release? Like, it's just going to travel west, and that's what we've been seeing in the data too. When we start digging into the Ohio stuff, the Michigan stuff that Ben Lukanen did, those genes are. Because we just constantly reinforcing that, right? You can't, if it's just coming out of a pen and you're dumping into the population, you can't stop it because it's there every year and they breed every year, right?
Yep. Some proportion of them breed every single year, even if it's 3% of, hundreds of thousands as we know it now. It's still a substantial amount. And if you do that every single year over and over and over, eventually you have what we have now.
Yeah.
And eventually, if you keep doing it, you eventually have what France has now.
Well, and the Atlantic Flyway folks asked us several years ago, they're like, well, the mallard population grew for years and then it plummeted. And it's like, that's the tipping point, right? Like, you eventually have enough stuff in there that those hen mallards are just like laying eggs and not sitting on those eggs and walking away,
And the only other place that we have sort of this a good temporal data set like that is New Zealand, where they brought in 30,000 birds. It's a funny story, but they went to Europe, bought game farm mallards. They're like, oh, we should get some wild birds. But then when they came to North America, they just went and bought mallards. And I was like, oh, you bought the same mallards, because they've just
Right.
bought game farm mallards. So they started with about 30,000 game farm mallards, and that's more or less what they saw, was that population sort of collapsed, and now they've got like 3 million mallards, right?
Well, because they
These
stopped
things.
it, right?
Yeah.
Like
They stopped it.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It was
And
like there was some like maybe good hybridization that went on, hybrid
for the
vigor,
mallards, not for
right?
gray ducks.
Not for a gray duck. Yeah, but then that population ended up stabilizing rather than the
Right.
constant pumping in of the artificially selected genes.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I say that it's sort of a similar situation, because potentially the fact that it's an island with no seasonality, no predators, it allowed that time frame for those birds to actually survive long enough to interbreed and that sort of gain those aspects. Whereas here, had you had that same number of birds, there's enough predators, the inability to enough freeze ups and all these things, that probably those birds would have just been wiped out.
They would have probably disappeared.
quick.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. All right, let's go with the
Anyways.
number 2, which is basically like some states start to restrict, others don't, but like migration isn't happening, weather's changing, things aren't getting to South Carolina, maybe local California mallards are declining, and Washington and Oregon mallards are declining. Alaska mallards are still doing well, but this leads to people just dumping more game farm mallards out. Is that scenario much different than the just continue release of game farm mallards everywhere? Like, it's restricted in the central Mississippi because the mid-continent wants to keep their wild mallard, but the other
more or
places
less,
just keep doing it.
And more or less, that's actually what is closer to what's happening now. So there's some release going on in the Central Valley of California. And then there's the Atlantic Flyway. And even talking with some of the states within the Central Flyway, a lot of them actually already have mandates that don't allow release. Right. I know
Right.
South Dakota has it. I believe North Dakota has it. It's just not really a thing. Now there's grumblings from private folks in Nebraska and others that are like, we'd like to release them, and I hope they don't. But it's just not really a thing. And we see it when we look at ancestry on the landscape through like our Duck DNA project, or all the projects that we've been a part of. And since I really started monitoring this really in 2010, the Central Flyway has been very steady, of like basically no game farm ancestry there. And so it's really this influx of birds, really the growing rate, significant growing rates in the Great Lakes that we're seeing is the cause for concern for birds in the prairie potholes, because that's going to be constantly flowing into there every single year. And we see those tick ups every so often in birds that we get out of the Dakotas and whatnot during hunting season.
Yeah. And like I'm going to pick on, like, it feels like Alabama and Indiana seem to be like two places that somehow all of a sudden started doing game farmy stuff.
Yeah.
More than they did before. And I'm like, what? That doesn't even make sense. Like, I mean, I can see Alabama, like, you're not getting mallards like you used to, and you still want to see them. So we're just going to grow them, and we're going to sell you chicks and put them out there. And that's a thing that's going on. But like, there seems to be a signal in Indiana that I can't quite figure out where that's coming from. But it's kind of there.
Yeah, when we did with Ben Lukanen's work, that was the best sampling of Indiana that we had. And while Michigan and Ohio is fairly bad, where like about 50% of their birds are substantial game farm ancestry, I think it was like 80+% in Indiana. I'm just like, what is it? Yeah, I had the same thought. I was like, what's happening in Indiana? It's super odd.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a little bit of an anomaly, and maybe it's, if you look at it, it's kind of farmland and then urban areas, so it could possibly be that it could be an urban center thing. Like the mallards you actually have that breed there are just in urban centers, and those are going to be the type of ducks that are a little manky. Let's say manky, so
manky mallards.
Manky mallards.
Yeah. So anyways, getting back to it, I think that you would build an aviary around the Central Flyway or a wall. and put shooters everywhere. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, this is a tough topic, Phil, and
It
I think
is.
what you and I are doing is we're just chipping away at the edges of it and trying to answer questions that we put in the hands of decision makers to then do the good work.
Yep.
That's where I've always tried to be on this. Stay out of the fray, do the work. You know, obviously, if somebody corners you on a podcast, you're gonna be like, "Oh, this is how I feel," you know. But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, like we're cranking out as solid of information, I think, as anybody can, and trying
Oh
to do the
yeah.
good work. Because again, the only thing at stake is the integrity of the and long term sustainability of the wild North
Wild
American
Mallard.
mallard. So that's the last question for you. And it's just wide open. What is the future of wild mallards in North America?
Make your next move with American Express Business Platinum. You'll get 5 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Plus, enjoy access to the American Express Global Lounge Collection. And with the welcome offer of 150,000 points, your business can soar to all new heights. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum. Amex Business Platinum, built for business by American Express.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
I mean, hard to say. Depends on what everybody decides to do. I think that the
So like
population.
let's think
Yeah.
about this from a habitat. Like this is like a wholesale. It's not just a
This
game
is a
farming
wholesale
question. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, in all honesty, if you don't have any habitat, if we lose our habitat in the prairies and we continue to lose clean water, and we lose the farm bill, all birds. And in fact, there was the most recent avian report, and the only thing really holding up waterfowl is our habitat management and our the amount of habitat that is enrolled in CRP and other private individuals that are maintaining this habitat and put things like entities like Ducks Unlimited, making sure those entities remain. Yeah, if you lose the habitat, it doesn't really matter what you have. I guess we'll just have pigeons, rats, and some manky mallards around. Um, but
We're going right down the bottom of the hole here. So yeah.
oh, cockroaches too.
Oh goodness.
Assuming like a semi status quo, and you've got habitat and you've got all these things, and you've got a carrying capacity of these days 7 million mallards in the prairie potholes or so. Then I would think that we need to maintain that. And the integrity of the wild mallard is only as good as its parental population. So as long as that population is monitored and maintained, then you've got a bright future. Not everywhere in the country. Depends on
Yeah,
where you
stuff's
are,
gonna
but where
change,
those
right?
mallards.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, but where you are with where those mallards are and their migratory capacity, their breeding capacity, as long as that's maintained, then that would be a bright future. If habitat and manky mallards take over, or habitat loss and manky mallard increases, then not so bright.
That's where I'm at, is that in my lifetime and beyond, I feel I have a lot of optimism for waterfowl and waterfowl hunting as long as we continue to work kind of all together, put this good science behind it,
Yep.
make good decisions. and really think about this is not just a duck problem, but a human problem too. Like you mentioned, clean water. Like those things
Yep.
matter to ducks a heck of a lot more than we think. I mean, you can have all the water in the world, but if it's horribly degraded,
Yeah.
because of pollution issues and other things, you're not going to be in a good state. And the one thing I continue to go back to and why we have to stay together as duck hunters is we're like, let's just say we're 1 million strong, right? That's a very small population, but our impact on the environment has been massive. So keeping the duck hunting culture going in this country, and as well as glomming on people. I've always told folks, I'm like, you're a birder and you don't hunt. I don't care. Just don't get in my way.
Yeah.
And agree that wetlands are cool things and they're for flood retention and clean water and all that stuff. I mean, I like them for all the things they do, and also shooting ducks in them and producing ducks to shoot.
I mean, the thing that's holding up marsh birds, non-waterfowl marsh birds up, is the fact that habitat's there for waterfowl. That habitat's there for waterfowl, and it brings in all the other critters that use that habitat, and that requires clean water and the availability of that habitat on there, not turning it into corn or something else.
I love it, buddy. I appreciate you, Phil, very much. Appreciate being on the Foul Weather podcast, and this isn't the last time we're going to see you. So, thanks for chatting with us and doing the whole legal infringement, choose your own adventure thought process.
I love it.
All right. Be good, my friend. Till next time. All right. Next up to talk mallards and game farm mallards and wild mallards and what the heck's going on with mallards on this continent is PhD student Dominic Hockenbury. And Dominic's actually in my lab, so some of this stuff's going to cross over. But Dom is probably also, and this is the first time you're going to hear about this, it's a new series that we're going to run on the Foul Weather podcast. I think he'll be back at some point to talk about himself a little bit more, how he got into being a young waterfowl professional, because that's what we're going to call it. We're calling it the Young Waterfowl Professionals series, and we want to talk to the kids that are out there that are interested in careers in waterfowl, that are coming maybe from their undergrad to their grad students that have ongoing projects, as well as folks that have recently graduated, maybe up till, 5-10 years into a career, maybe with DU or Fish and Wildlife Service or something like that. Folks that aren't ancient news like me. So this isn't going to be the last time you hear from Dominic. So Dominic, welcome to the Foul Weather podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit, Bud, about, I know your story. I actually met you in the lineup at the Refuge, I think, and then you were also part of the Ducks Unlimited Club while you were at SU, but a little bit about your academic story and finding duck hunting and, how you ended up studying mallard genetics at ESF.
Yeah, so for my master's, I was over at Syracuse University. Doing my master's work was basically the genetic basis of reproductive evolution, which I ended up working with fruit flies, believe it or not. And
we always joke about this. Somehow you jump from fruit flies to mallards. Well, so it's a pretty big organismal advancement, I think. So
yeah,
cool
it's
stuff.
a model organism, basic scientific research. This is more applied, but it was perfect that I could actually match my personal interest and my hobbies, waterfowl, something I really care about with what I was doing academically. And it's definitely a lot more motivating and I enjoy it. It's my favorite thing to do. Think about ducks 24/7, 365 days a year.
Yeah. So how many years, though, have you been duck hunting? I think this is one of the things that we find with you. And I'm always like, hey, get in the lab. But, obviously we've got this passion for duck hunting and you're out chasing birds too. But some of that stems, I think, from having been in it for maybe a shorter period of time than some folks. So when did you find duck hunting?
So I think it was right around COVID, around 2020. So I've been doing it for like 5 years now, which is relatively short, but I had really good mentors who had been doing it their whole lives. So I learned really quick and I fell right into it, soon away. It was a trap.
You're geared you're geared up better than me anymore. I just do like shoestring stuff. But when did you outfit yourself with a full-blown boat to, chase sea ducks and all that type of stuff?
Well, right away, one of the guys that I started hunting with had all that stuff. So we literally communal do it, help out with decoys, help boat work and everything. But yeah, we go everywhere from out hunting sea ducks out in Massachusetts to hunting sea ducks out on Lake Ontario and hitting the Finger Lakes for divers. But I kind of like the whole diversity of everything that we could do, which we've talked about before. In New York, you can do anything from sea ducks on Lake Ontario to shooting mallards in a cornfield.
Yeah, it's just not as good as it can be some places, I think, consistency wise, right?
No,
But I think,
consistency, no.
yeah, but I think it can still be very good. This is the thing I brought up recently. I was on an interview with Ramsey. That's going to probably be coming out maybe before this on the Duck Season Somewhere podcast. And the comment was like, hey, we really focus a lot on these core areas like the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, which is really important to ducks in general, and Arkansas, which is a really important culturally duck state. But man, there's ducks everywhere, and it's easy for people to find duck hunting. And there's all kinds of corners where duck hunting is just running really strong. Duck hunter numbers are decent. Duck culture is strong, and there's still a good number of ducks to be found. So, and I think, Dominic, you're a kind of example of finding all of that and finding that culture. So what role do you feel like have you found people organically? Has it been through social media? Like, where have you found folks and mentors, or did they kind of find you?
It's completely organically. I'm really involved with Ducks Unlimited. I'm part of two committees, and that's been a big source of finding people to hunt with and also friends. But it's always like kind of like a friend of a friend of a friend, and then next thing you know, you're good friends, and you're even at their weddings and whatnot. Buying decoys from people, and next thing you know, you're at their wedding. But yeah, some of my best friends kind of come through hunting, and we do stuff outside of hunting, but during the hunting season, I'd say we're pretty close.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's a great culture to be part of. Well, we had a long podcast already, and we just got finished up talking with Dr. Phil Lavretsky. So let's jump into kind of, in short, we talked about the issues with morphology, migration, feeding efficiency, nest attendance, all that you're familiar with, Dom. So in short, what do you plan on testing in your study for your PhD, and to see if these, different metrics are in fact, kind of maladaptive? And I guess, how do we know if these traits are going to continue in the mallard population in the future?
So the two things that I'm looking at doing right away is what you hinted on before was the mechanoreceptors in the bill tips. So working on that as well as doing some genome-wide association studies, which is basically looking for any variation in the genome of certain birds, our game farm mallards, our early generational hybrids, and our wild birds, and statistically associating variation with traits that we are looking for. So that would be like more like lack of migratory behavior, lower daily movements, and poor nesting attendance.
So really looking for the genetic basis of this, and then, okay, so then you find those genes that say this maybe a hybrid has, or game farms and hybrids have this gene for poor nest attendance, or poor incubation consistency, and things that we know affect reproductive output. Like, what can you do with it next? So what? Like, so you've got that. Like, what does it mean to the mallard population in general?
So outwardly, I don't think the genes really mean anything to the mallards, but what they would be doing would be having a significant influence on predisposing some of those behaviors that we've thus far observed, especially through some of Ben's work. From a physical standpoint, the mechanoreceptors, we talked about Susanna's work where they feed at a reduced rate compared to wild birds. It's kind of more asking like, well, why do they feed at a reduced rate compared to wild birds? We know that their measurements of their bill are a little different. That's probably influencing it as well. And their lamellae spacing is slightly different, but I'm not entirely convinced that's what's causing it. But we looked at these mechanoreceptors. So these are basically tactile receptors in the tip of the bill. Some of them sense like temperature. Some of them sense vibration. And they differ between species of waterfowl based on feeding strategy. And they also differ between types of birds that are more visual feeders versus birds that use tactile reception to feel for their food sources.
Yeah, so if you're a goose that like plucks grass, right, or a diving duck that visually swims down and sees a zebra mussel and grabs it to eat, or a snail and grabs it to eat, versus something that has to strain through the mud, the expectation would be that you would have more mechanoreceptors.
Yes. So the one paper that's out there comparing different species, yeah, like birds such as like our widgeon, our gadwall, and our diving ducks that are more large food foragers that eat in a lot of like submerged aquatic vegetation, they have lower amount of these receptors.
Hmm.
And then birds that really strain for their food and sift for small seeds like pintail, teal, and even some mallards have a relatively high amount of these mechanoreceptors compared to other species of waterfowl.
Yeah, and where we kind of went with this is that morphologically, if these bills have become more goose-like and the nail at the end is more advanced in the game farm birds and they're like picking corn and pellets, maybe they've actually lost the need for these mechanoreceptors. I mean, you don't, as an animal or a plant, something that costs you energy to maintain, you know, in that organism, if it's not useful anymore in any way, sometimes will disappear. And so the thought is that we might have reduced mechanoreceptors in these game farm bird bills, and that might get passed into the wild population as well.
Yeah, exactly. And we were talking about all this being compounding. Is do they just behave this way? Is that why they have shorter daily movement? Is that why they're not migrating and their nesting's down? Or is it stem from the fact that, they're having a difficult time feeding and they can't meet the energetic demands required for nesting, daily movement, and long migrations?
Yeah, it's cool stuff. I mean, obviously, I'm involved with it with Dr. Phil Lavretsky as well and others. So let's keep her rolling here, though. Or how will we know? This was kind of the final part of that three-part question I gave you. It was a lot at once. How will we know if these traits are going to continue in the mallard population into the future? What we're kind of putting quotes around them as maladaptive, right? But they don't seem like things that are good for the mallard population. So how do we know if these traits are going to continue in that mallard population into the future?
One of the projects that I've proposed to kind of understand if they continue is through this genome-wide association study. Anything that we identify as being associated with these traits, we're also going to have data on how heritable they are. At which generations do they persist in terms of being hybridized with a game farm bird? And from this, we can understand how inheritance works. We can work with population modeling programs to kind of understand based upon a whole gathering of data that we have on these about their life histories to model how prevalent these traits are going to, how prevalent these signatures are going to be for these traits in future populations if we completely turn off the spigot for game farm mallard releases, or if we continue at status quo right now, or even increase them.
So, like, how quickly, if they are maladaptive, like, are they purged from a population, with reducing game farm mallards? Because that's one of the things. If they're maladaptive, everybody's like, how do they stay in the population? And the comment is, well, you just keep jamming them back in by releasing game farm mallards. That's how they continue to probably exist and maybe even manifest themselves at a greater frequency in the population.
Yeah. So what it seems like is they do not persist. Well, what happens is at a certain point, if these hybrids breed back to wild mallards and aren't subjected to more breedings by game farm mallards, these traits are gradually weaned out by natural selection.
Mm-hmm, for
So
sure.
pretty much over time, if we just stopped releasing them, these traits that we're seeing should go away or be extremely diminished based
Yeah,
on what we know now.
because even at that, like, we don't see we don't see a lot of like less than what 60% wild or something in the
No.
population. So saying somehow this game farm stuff is pushed out of the population pretty quick. The question I think we have on our mind too is, like, as we're dumping these things in to the population, how deleterious is that each year that, like, hey, not a lot of these survive, but if 12% of them survive and we're putting out 280,000 of them a year, all those back crosses, if those F1s game farm by wilds are basically a reproductive loss, what are we losing in the population every single year too? So I think there's a lot of very complex math and complex modeling, and then there's some pretty simple stuff that can be done here too.
Yeah. Like essentially, it's having those birds out there and inputting those genes into the population takes away a potential breeding opportunity from a wild bird, two wild
Mhm.
birds rather than having mutt mallards out there breeding.
Yep, our favorite term, mutt mallards. I like the term manky. I think it's like Scottish. It's a Scottish slang term meaning less than desirable. So I'm always a
Yeah.
fan of manky. Mutt
I
works
guess
too, though. Hey, so the last question here is, what is the future? It's a big question. What is the future of wild mallards in North America, given kind of current status of what we're seeing with hybrids and game farm releases and stuff like that? And honestly, just feel free to like take your scientist hat off and just speculate about everything from a population realm and a politics realm and all that stuff, Dom.
so. I feel like this is like a common conversation I'm always having with my friends in the truck when we're driving around scouting or whatnot. But my non-scientist perception of this is it seems like if you go over social media, people argue, duck hunters are arguing about everything from dead hens don't lay eggs, the population numbers. The one thing I don't see much arguing about is had these game farm mallards being detrimental towards our wild mallard population.
Hmm.
And I feel from a hunter's standpoint that the clientele for these releases of game farm mallards at these shooting preserves and clubs is becoming educated on the potential negative consequences of these releases. And I feel like the clientele is going to gradually age out at these game farms, and naturally there might be a significant reduction, if not a complete halt, in people wanting to go and participate in hunts associated with these game farm mallards. And if so, based upon what we know, once these releases end or are reduced to a significant amount that they're not influencing our population, these traits are going to be naturally selected out, and we're going to return to having mallards that are acting like wild mallards as they should.
So I would expect from that it might take a long time on portions of the Atlantic coast for those traits to be weaned out, just because it's a hybrid swarm, so they're going to hold them longer. But slowly, the crosses with the wilds should, work those. I'm just going to go with quality genes, naturally selected genes back into that population. But I'd say in like the Mississippi Flyway and places where we're just starting to see more releases. Actually, it's starting to move west a little bit. Indiana's got a bunch. Alabama's got a bunch now. And maybe that would revert more quickly because they're also just going to be swamped by a much, much larger wild mallard population potentially, too.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to quote Phil on this, but when we were talking about it, his estimate was 10 generations. Completely stop at 10 generations.
10
It's going to
years. That's 10 years.
It's going to
Yeah.
take 10 years for everything to kind of revert to acting more like wild mallards. Because pretty much anything, it seems like it's 70% and above wild acts
Mhm.
like a wild mallard.
Now, I want to be clear to our listenership, too, that we are wildly speculating that this is all driven by, some of this population decline in the Atlantic Flyway and then in the Great Lakes region is driven by, game farm genetics. And I would say I'm on the end of the jury still out on that one, but every single thing we test shows that, and that's in this podcast too, is that the game farm genes moving into the wild population isn't a positive thing, right? So
No.
I think that's where I land. And then I get into the ethical end of it, which we talked about already. I kind of find it ethically repugnant to just let animals go to shoot them in general. So, but, biologists don't make decisions on that. So I think the idea here is, we're working very hard and very quickly to find out to what extent these are or are not kind of detrimental. And I think, Dom, you're going to, like a lot of your population modeling and population genetics is really going to go a long ways to telling us, how detrimental these traits and these game farm mallards may be. So thanks for all your work. It's going to be great to, I don't know, I expect you to be in the lab for 4 more years, probably, something like that. But we will see. Hey, what's we'll get into a little bit of the young waterfowl professional series. Like, what's the career goal? I think I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but do you want to be like the next Phil Lavretsky?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of talked about this. I kind of came in, I was like from SU teaching more genetics and stuff. I don't want to be a professor. I don't want to teach.
Yeah, it's horrible, by the way. You should never do it.
Now at ESF with these students and this type of subject matter, it's actually really fun to do.
Yeah.
Um, Especially when the younger generation gets really inspired. Like we've been doing bird surveys, taking people out, and they're seeing hundreds of ducks pile into a wetland, and they're all excited. That makes it right there. So I would not be opposed to teaching. Kind of like my academic ancestry kind of forming here between you and Phil. So I'm getting more of a genetics background, but also more of the ecological management based background too, which I like. I kind of like blending the two of you, being like more of Phil and Schumer in training.
I appreciate that a bunch. And I got to tell you, at least 75% of my energy comes from the students. So appreciate you, Dom. And thanks for jumping on the Follow Other podcast here briefly and talking Mallards and Mallard genetics with us. So we'll have you back sometime, bud.
All right. Sounds good.
Well, there you have it, folks. The 4-part Mallards series is complete, and we hope you learned a whole lot about the history and the future of the mighty old greenhead across this continent and how hen mallards make it, or maybe sometimes they don't, with the changes of each season. Stick with us next as we dive into the data stream info series. How does the bee pop work? How do harvest surveys work? What does banding tell us? And so much more. We also just introduced the Young Waterfowl Professional Series with a chat with Dominic, so keep an eye out for those over the coming months. If you are interested as being a guest on the Fowl Weather Podcast Young Waterfowl Professional Series, please reach out. These folks, these young future waterfowl conservationists, these passionate people about our waterfowl and wetland resources, their stories need to be told. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled, and shoot straight, my friends.